Hi, Garfield, friends and family. This is Justin Young, your school psychologist, here to answer a few questions that you have. So, this is actually a really good question. So, the thing I want to say is that dyslexia, dysgraphia, and dyscalculia are all learning disabilities. They're just not disability categories under IDEA. So, if we look at the National Center for Learning Disabilities and we look at the description for that, what we see is it is not just a definition that encompasses written expression, but also in the physical act of writing. So some of the things listed are just like a tight, awkward pencil grip, tiring quickly while writing, and avoiding writing tasks. It even, as you can see, it says avoiding drawing tasks, which is interesting. It speaks more to the physicality of writing and not so much the written expression component. So in addition to the question about the difference between dysgraphia and bad handwriting, I also got the question about what happens in terms of a student being tested for this and if something like this is noticed. Well, if the student just specifically has bad handwriting, they're not likely to be evaluated. We do not provide special education services based off of bad handwriting, but if there are other concerns specifically with the quality of written expression, then this is something that can be looked at. It would go through the typical referral process where you might want to either touch base with me or the school counselor, and that student will be brought up at a SIT team meeting and we'll discuss appropriate interventions and strategies. If it does get to the evaluation process, it'll be academic assessments that are geared to look at written expression. Under IDEA, under a specific learning disability and written expression, it's really going to speak to those components of the quality of writing, whereas dysgraphia will speak to the physicality of it. If you have concerns for the student in terms of getting maybe a possible referral, really start thinking about the written expression component. Like, does the student struggle to organize thoughts down on paper? When the student's writing essay, how far is it below grade level? Are they struggling with syntax and grammar? Are they struggling with even appropriately answering the questions in writing? So one of the questions that I got is actually about the referral process and what that looks like, and if a teacher has concerns about a specific student, at what point do I get involved? So the thing that I would want to say is that if you start to have academic concerns about a student, or really any concerns at all, you can bring those up to the school counselor. Typically, if a student is referred to me for special education services, for a special education evaluation, and it has not gone through the SIT process, I will refer that student back to the SIT team so that we can discuss strategies.
Take a quick look at this flowchart. This is the special education referral flowchart. Basically, we can see the process of what a referral looks like. So if a referral is made, then we have a 25-day school day timeline before we have to make a determination to evaluate. As you can see, if we decide not to evaluate, then that process is going to be referred back to the SIT team.
The second that a student is brought up at a SIT meeting, though, that a school counselor brings up a student, we start thinking about interventions or strategies, whether that is looking at attendance or just like targeted instruction, depending on what that student specifically needs. I'm a part of that process pretty early on, and I don't mind being looped in the second that there are concerns. So a lot of the things that we have to get during the referral process is information that we can get before the referral process. So just like what are the concerns for the student? So if someone says an area of concern is reading, what is that student really struggling with? Are they struggling with phonological awareness? Are they struggling with their fluency? Are they struggling with decoding? Are they struggling with vocabulary? Are they struggling with just basic comprehension? What exactly is that area that that student is struggling in, and then what specific interventions have been happening. So always feel free to email me about any students that you have concerns about. A student can be referred for having a disability at any time and can be made by a parent, guardian, a school employee, or just any other person's knowledge about the student. So another great question that I got asked is how are students who are receiving English language instruction, how are ELL students? How do we tease out the difference between a student who's struggling primarily due to language acquisition or due to a disability? One of the ways that we start this process is with the ELL decision matrix, and we usually fill this out as a team during the referral process. The primary purpose of it is just to go through each possible thing that might be impacting the student's language acquisition. So one of the first things that's listed is the student's primary language. We have to look and see if that primary language is transparent in nature, meaning is it phonetically predictable. So something like Spanish is phonetically predictable, so the switch from Spanish to English is going to be more difficult. So in that case, we would make a mark on the graph to indicate that more time and interventions are needed. As we just look through this document, there's some examples. Another thing that we might look at is if the student did not learn to read in their primary language. If that's the case, then we are also trying to teach the process of reading while also teaching a new language, which overall slows the learning process. Once we go through this process, we can look at where we filled in certain things, and we can see if the data supports a referral or an evaluation, or if the data supports more interventions. The team decides that more information is needed, or if the student shows evidence of a disability, then the evaluation process can begin. And during the evaluation process, there are also measures that we take to rule out the language factor or cultural factors. One of the things that we talk about is how to evaluate a student, or what measures or instruments to use in the evaluation process. And there are also cognitive tests that allow us to look at specifically nonverbal skills. Another thing that school psychologists sometimes look at is their cognitive academic language proficiency. So in addition to just giving the normal gamut of academic tests, we might also try to determine that students' cognitive academic language proficiency. CALP is defined as language proficiency in the academic setting, or those aspects of language that emerge with formal schooling. So if we get a score and the CALP level is really low, we might say that the student just requires more English instruction.
Another thing that we can look at is the CLIM, which stands for the Cultural Language Interpretive Matrix. Basically, we are able to put cognitive test scores into a software that allows us to look and see how much of it is culturally loaded and how much of it is linguistically loaded, and then it spits out a graph.
The downward slope indicates someone's scores that are depreciated due to a cultural or language factor.
Over here on the left are the things that are the least culturally loaded and language loaded, and over on the right are the things that are the most culturally loaded and most linguistically loaded. So it stands to reason that someone who is struggling with language might do more poorly on these tests. So we see that this student shows weaknesses that are not consistent with someone just struggling with language. So then we would be able to conclude that something else is a concern, and that that student might have a disability.
So one of the great questions that I got asked was by someone who actually had the answer for me. So that was a really good experience for me to go out and learn something that I did not already know. So one of the questions that was asked was, what athletic opportunities are offered at Garfield High School for students with disabilities? And what I learned is that this will be changing very shortly. There will be opportunities through Title IX that is a unified program starting in January, unified sports program for basketball in the winter, and then soccer or track in the spring. It's an inclusive program for students with disabilities. And if you have any more questions about that, feel free to touch base with Carol Lynch. It's an exciting opportunity that is coming to Garfield High School. One of the questions that I got was, what is the difference between an IEP and a 504? And what do I need to do as a teacher in the class to help these students and to differentiate between these students? So one of the first things I want to say about this is that Dylan Kautsky actually sent out an email probably around the same time that I got a question for this. I got this question. He simply just said that as a career ladder teacher, one of his goals is to help teachers differentiate between 504s and IEPs. So I don't want to go too much into that because you can touch base with Dylan. But what I do want to say is that an IEP is a much more complex document that has present levels, annual goals, it has modifications and accommodations, whereas a 504 goes over accommodations. So if we take a quick look at accommodations, These things do not alter what the student is expected to learn. They just alter how that information is given to them. Another common one that's not listed there is if a student has anxiety and struggles to get up in front of her classmates, he or she might be able to record a presentation and play it for the teacher that way. If we take a quick look at modifications, we can see that the curriculum and what the student is expected to learn and what information that student is expected to give back to the teacher is going to be different because those are modifications. So completing different homework problems, answering different test questions. Instead of one project, they might get a simpler project or a project that covers material that is more on that student's level. I hope that provides a little bit of clarification, but again, as Dylan Kautsky had noted, he does want to work with teachers to help improve this process. So again, here are some more questions just simply about the IEP. And again, if you have any questions about an IEP, it makes sense to touch base with that case manager. The IEP is an individualized education plan. So if you touch base with that case manager, it is the best way to figure out the answer to those questions. That said, I think that one of the questions was just about where is a student currently performing. And in an IEP, there are present levels listed. Those present levels should have the information that you're looking for in terms of figuring out where they are at with their current academic ability. The IEP at a glance does not have that same information. So if you touch base with the student's case manager, they should be able to provide that information to a certain degree. If the student is in the reevaluation process or has been recently reevaluated, the information is likely to even be more up to date. But the best way to be informed about these levels is just to go to as many of those meetings as you can, because that's really where a lot of the information is shared.